Welcome, everyone, to Brilliant Minds, Bold Questions, a 5-part virtual event series exploring questions being addressed by some of the world's top researchers. Each talk pairs speakers and moderators from across disciplines, sectors, and the world to explore the questions shaping our future. If you're not familiar with us, CIFAR is a Canadian-based global organization that convenes extraordinary minds to address the most important questions facing science and humanity. My name is Rachel Parker, and I'm Senior Director of Research at CIFAR, and it's my pleasure to introduce to you Dan Breznitz and Woody Powell today. Dan is an expert on the globalization of rapid innovation-based industries and has led pioneering research on the distributional impact of innovation policies. Woody's interests focus on the processes through which ideas and practices are transferred across organizations and the role of networks in facilitating or hindering innovation. Today, we will explore growth and equity. Can we have both? Woody, I'd like to turn it over to you now to ask the first question.
Sure. Thank you, Rachel. Dan, thank you for your new book on innovation and real places. We'll talk a little bit about what you think of as unreal places. I have a feeling my territory out here in California is one such place in your mind. But you look at innovation that's not focused on Silicon Valley or Seattle or Shenzhen, but rather on opportunities in communities that don't normally get considered when one thinks about them as centers of prosperity. I guess I want to start by asking you, isn't innovation fundamentally about breaking rules and challenging existing ways of doing things? And does it always have to have an outsider quality to it?
Thank you, Woody. And yes, just by your question, it is very clear that you come from Silicon Valley, which is slightly unreal. No, so I would say that unfortunately, in the last few years, our debate, especially public debate about innovation, has been completely divorced from reality, and we forgot what innovation is. There is that thing which is called invention, coming up with new ideas for products or services. Innovation is actually putting that ideas into reality in the marketplace. And that includes all stages, from coming up with an idea to after service, production, assembly, design. This is the real innovation. And if you want to see real innovation in action, creating widespread prosperity, forget Silicon Valley, come with me to Taiwan. Come with me to Finland, come with me to Germany. Indeed, unless you really like Tesla, and by the way, even if you like Tesla, open it up and you'll find out that most of it is Bosch, a German company. I know Alan doesn't like that, but that's the truth. And that's where you really have innovation. And that through that movement, through those stages, through that constant and continuous improvement, changing, tweaking, is where you got real advantage to welfare and real economic growth and prosperity. Just think for a moment about the millions of engineering hours that have been put into the innovation of how to improve the CPU, the memory, the fiber optics, the amount of data you can move in the fiber optics. So you and I can now talk on Zoom.
You said a number of things there I want to explore. You expanded the idea of innovation to think about invention in every stage of production. You also added this idea of continuous improvement. Those are two things that are sort of different than, the one big disruptive idea. You also mentioned countries like Taiwan, Finland, Israel is another example, that are very diverse on some dimensions, but seem to be places quite different from, say, the traditional centers and the tech capitals, where the gains of innovation are shared more widely. So what's the relationship between this continuous improvement at every stage of production and being in a society where more people benefit from these advancements?
Sure. So let me go back to the places that you mentioned. I think that one thing that we have to understand, and that's why in the book there is another title, which is about globalization. Once you have globalization, and the way we have a globalization, meaning that you take a product or a service, you basically now defragment it to several stages, and each country or place in the world now does those things. So let's think about the semiconductor industry for a moment. The US has a beautiful one. Israel has a great one. Taiwan has a great one. Korea has a great one. And yet, and in those places, some of the same companies work in all those places. But what they do in those places are completely different. So in Silicon Valley and in Israel, they try to put new ideas on silicon. But they, as we now know, thanks to Intel and what happened in the United States, without the Taiwanese company called TSMC, we no longer know how to put those ideas on silicon. And that's where Taiwan excels. And Korea, when you buy any mobile phone, including an Apple, the second highest amount of profit now occurs to Samsung, which control critical things that go to every smartphone on earth. That also tells you where you have a power over the network. And let me just, in this small examples, Taiwan and Korea might have actually more power on the whole network on the mobile phones than Silicon Valley right now. The second is those different kinds of innovation necessitate different skills, different finance, provide to the community completely different kinds of employment. So you mentioned Israel, which is a small country and everybody thinks is a great economic miracle, versus Taiwan, let's say, or Finland. Unfortunately, as somebody who's done a lot of research on oil, but also grew up in Israel, what happened in Israel, because Israel imitates Silicon Valley, it might be the only case of a place that actually managed to imitate Silicon Valley fully. Israel is now one of the most, just like Silicon Valley, one of the most unequal places on earth. As a matter of fact, in the same years we have this massive economic miracle, the Israeli society went that way. And right now, 1 out of every 5 households in Israel is under the poverty line and basically on a treadmill to nowhere, while only the graduates of the best universities, best technological units, their financier and celebrity chefs are enjoying high-end Silicon Valley wages and a lottery ticket called, stock options for an IPO. So I think one of the real questions that real places should have is, why do you want to have innovation? Why spend taxpayers' money on innovation if you're a small city? And if the reason is, I want to create prosperity for my citizen, my residents, imitating Silicon Valley, even if you can be successful, might be the wrong answer.
We saw a good example of what we were describing with semiconductors, with U.S. automakers, where they're having to slow or stop production for trucks because of the lack of access to chips from Taiwan at the moment. So these global production networks are hugely important. Okay, so Israel is a case of replication without the gains. Let's think more about how innovation could be pursued and the gains can be more widely shared. So one of the messages I took from your book was, don't try to emulate these, canonical places. But then I'm sure people want to know, what dreams should Cleveland, Ohio have, Brampton, Ontario, or Birmingham, UK? What can be the ways they pursue innovation policies in the context of old industries, let us say?
So first, let's talk about an old industry. And let me give you an example of one of the oldest industries in the world, shoes. The things you put on your foot. And let's talk about high-end luxury, women shoes. And once you look at that industry, which, by the way, create a lot of prosperity, you found out that one of the places which has the highest and the most sustained prosperity for people who are not just designer from, the top-end schools is Riviera di Brenta in Italy, just about Venice. And the reason is that they focus on what I call the second stage of innovation. So if you're a wonderful designer from Milan or Paris or New York, and you design a really cool shoe, and you say, okay, now this shoe has to be made. I have to be able to sell it for an X amount of price. And a real human being has to wear that shoes. And if that real human being is paying 2,000 euros, they might actually want to walk on it from time to time. So it cannot just explode. The place that will make that happen for you is Brenta. And it's a set of suppliers, very high-end suppliers, very high-end. If you want to think about it, designing of how you make an idea into a product, running out into production, very high-end production, selling it to you. And by the way, Woody, if you're not creative enough this year and you had only 100 new shoes and you need 200, you can also get the Brenta people to come up with another 100. And that's very wide prosperity for people from those who can actually design shoes, the creatives, to the people who know how to put, the sole to the end of a shoe and sell it.
Sounds like a story of the rediscovery of craft. And in one way, that rediscovery is a form of invention, taking something that's been around for a long time, applying it to new settings, paying attention to skill so that more and more people are involved in learning that skill. Is there a difference in our educational systems between places that focus more on high-end computer science and finance versus those that are more skill and application-based?
To a degree, yes, and definitely in the case of Brenta. But if I'll go to Taiwan, since we mentioned it again, Taiwan is also known for, I don't know if you ride bikes, but if you ride bikes, especially if you moved to mountain bikes a few years ago, by definition, you had a Taiwanese product, mostly, almost surely from Giant. And what you see in Taiwan is, again, they took a very old product. Basically, it's a diamond frame designed 200, 300 years ago, and infuse it with new technologies, in that case, new materials. So you can make the bike go on off-road. It will be light enough for people who are not looking like, Superman to actually carry it into the mountain and start mountain biking. What is interesting here, and the reason I wanted to say it, you need extremely high-end material science in order to do that. But you also need the people who produces. That means that while you have a very, very high-end universities and almost fundamental research and researchers in Taiwan, what they do in Taiwan and how they use those skills and the incentives that they get in order to use those skills, finance and other, are different. So again, depending on your stage and depending how you attack it, and depending if you're Cleveland and you have an amazing university, an amazing health system, or if you're Hamilton, Ontario, and you have the same, or you're in a place which closer to Brenta, if you want to think about, and you still have those craft skills, as you call them. Design a strategy around that. Design a strategy around a different stage of production. Do not assume that if you don't become New York, Silicon Valley, or Tel Aviv, you cannot innovate and gain prosperity. And unfortunately, as we have talked before, that conversation no longer exists with policymakers. They all think that if they're not Silicon Valley of the North, I'm in Canada, so at least 15 cities claim that title, they're not innovative. And I think it's a misservice to their own residents to think that way.
It's a really important insight. I take from it a couple of things. One, through all the stories in your wonderful book, there is this focus on continuous updating, whether it's bicycles or shoes. So there's a drive to constantly make these things better. And better doesn't involve disruption, often involves making things better so that consumers will, like them more. They'll be lighter. They'll be more durable. There are a lot of positives for many people in that. You use the word incentives. Okay, we typically think of incentives as tax breaks, government funding. I don't think those are the kinds of incentives you mean, though. So.
I will say, let's be very clear. Some of them are. Okay, there's a lot of role for government, and much of a role for government, especially with innovation, which is risk, is indeed with creating those incentives that you just talked about. But the other set of incentives, and again, it's a public-private policy, is a vision of how you want your society, a vision of status and what those people want to have, but also a set of regulations that allow or disallow different kind of business models, even if they lower short-term profit, which I think is really important right now, speaking about semiconductors manufacturing. Intel, it might be the one last American company that can announce that it is investing $20 billion in having fabrication or manufacturing sites for semiconductors without the CEO being fired within 5 minutes by Wall Street analysts and their friends. And those are the kinds of incentives which we don't talk about in a polite company. But I think that especially in North America, we should.
I hear you doing two things with that statement. One, telling us an important lesson, which is that we should care as much about the person who builds the bike, the person who crafts the shoes, the person who bravely makes a decision to invest in a new fab plant, as we should, the 26-year-old wunderkind who comes up with, the new way to take a vacation or to have food delivery. So that's a rethinking of who the stars of innovation are. There's also lots of discussion, though, about innovation as something that leads to gains for only a few. And I think that's, we'll turn to the audience now, and Rachel, you're in charge of that, to help us think more broadly about what are ways to make innovation more inclusive.
Before we turn to the audience, and I have a question that I wanted to ask first. Do you want to respond, Dan, or?
Sure. So let me just be very clear that that's exactly the reason why we, and when I say we, I mean you, I, Rachel, and another 12 people, have created a new CIFAR program, which is called Innovation, Equity, and the Future of Prosperity. And it's exactly that fear that we have, or that many have, that innovation, at least in the last 20 years, means that the few, and as Woody has very politely said, the few who are 26-year-old and a graduate of Stanford, Berkeley, and the U of T, so not exactly the people we should worry about, have all the gains, and the rest of the population does not. And what we're doing in the network, and what we are thinking about, is actually figuring out, whether it's true or not, and I think it's clearly not. And then wondering how, what would he call the incentives, or what other people might call different innovation policies, lead different places, countries, down at different trajectories of how they innovate and how the gains of our innovation are distributed throughout their societies and for whom. And that's exactly the discussion we're starting at CIFAR across multiple disciplines.
So the question that I have for you both is in some ways a follow-up to that, and kind of thinking through different types of innovation. Although potentially with a different meaning. So everyone seems to be putting their favorite adjective in front of the word innovation, whether it's social innovation, frugal innovation, inclusive innovation. And so I'm curious to hear your thoughts. First, are these important or necessary distinctions to make? And if they are, why?
I'll start and Dan can pick up. I think at one level, all of these are ways of trying to soften or appropriate the term innovation or transform it, so that the element of it that has to do with novelty and invention is retained, but you shift the discussion to ask innovation for whom. And I think it's that for whom that is now a new framing that is necessary in order to get people to think differently about the gains from innovation.
I agree. I mean, my fear is that soon, and since we are all sort of socio-political economists in this panel, that soon, if we will continue to have social innovation, inclusive innovation will end up like culture, meaning it is encompassing everything and has zero meaning by itself. And I'm very worried about that. So I would say the good thing about those hyphen of innovation is that it shows that people realize how important innovation is to their welfare and to their society. Indeed, we will all be stuck in our room without innovation, all kinds of innovation. The people who came with the vaccines, and as we in Canada knows, the people who actually know how to produce the vaccines are equally important. But I'm worried that those hyphenated innovation has now moving the debate slightly offside, and we are not asking the really important question about innovation, growth, equity, and prosperity anymore.
There's a question from the audience that's kind of bringing us back in some ways to where we started in talking about kind of place-based innovation. And in this case, it's specifically coming from Alberta, Canada, where the kind of innovation and the economy has really been dominated by fossil fuels and the energy sector. Although arguably now there seems to be a shift to some degree to become, some version, as you pointed out, Silicon Valley of the North, with a tech-driven focus around AI, and whether or not an approach like that makes sense. Again, I think the important part here is given Alberta's centrality around fossil fuels and energy.
So I'll start, and Woody, you can chip in. What is interesting for me about Canada, speaking about future, it's that there's actually two provinces who are playing this game as we speak. One is Alberta, the other is Newfoundland. And they have both chosen completely different strategies in the past. And then we have another case, which I'm really fond of, but I think Woody might know even more, of a small country called Norway, who also has exactly the same problem. So if you look across those cases, I think what is interesting in the two cases that I am slightly more inclined to say have chosen smart based on what they have is actually might be Newfoundland and Norway. Because what they have done is realize what kind of skills they already have around that industry. So it's not just AI, it's AI for mining, it's how to deal with ice, it's moving to what people call green tech. So you take your skills of knowledge and you try to diversify to related industries, or thinking about leapfrogging, but from a knowledge we already have. The other thing, which I think is as important, is let's assume for a moment that Alberta actually becomes Silicon Valley. What happens to all those people who now works in the industry at the moment? And the problem of trying to imitate and move to Silicon Valley, even if it's successful to one or two of Alberta's cities, is that it does not solve the real looming problem, and that is that Alberta was the engine of an unbelievable amount of really good jobs for upper middle class people who are not graduates of the best engineering schools for all of Canada. This is unfortunately coming to an end, I fear. And it's not just a problem for Alberta, but it's a problem for all of Canada, is to figure out what kind of jobs or what kind of innovation strategy we can have that actually supplies good jobs for those people. Maybe thinking like North Carolina, instead of thinking like Silicon Valley might be the way. But Woody, what do you think about Norway as a model?
Well, as you started talking, I was thinking Norway would be an interesting example for Alberta, where they take the endowments in the ground, under the sea, in the skills, and use those endowments to make a transfer into new industries, make investments in them. But I think maybe the harder issue is not like, what do we do on the ground, but what goes on in people's minds. So, in a place like Alberta, Texas, lots of places where people have reaped prosperity from old ways of doing things, change in doing something differently is often seen as a threat, as a huge challenge. They're trying to take away what we've done. But a different way to think about innovation is not just that it's created by outsiders, but maybe insiders want to change the way they're doing things in order to remain on top. There's a great Italian novel, Lampedusa, about if you want things to stay the same, you have to change. Is the theme from that. And Alberta at the moment has the prosperity that could be used to see beyond the world of fossil fuels. Whether they have the mindset to do that is, of course, a very different question.
We have time for one or two more quick questions, and there's some great ones coming in. So what is the role of corporate governance is really kind of at the heart of the issues that you're talking about, the distribution of power in the corporation, who makes the decisions, who distributes the profit to whom. What corporate governance systems work better for innovation? Is this something that's internal to the firm, or is regulation from state required?
So, Woody, do you want to be first, or?
Yeah, I guess you want me to go first, because that's one, such a phenomenally good question, and two, such an incredibly hard question. Okay. Clearly the model of how boards ought to operate or could operate in the context of entrepreneurial innovation has been a huge challenge, because the people running the boards have either been the VCs who back the companies or the founders, often with special shares that allow them to have enormous influence for a continuing period of time. And thinking about novelty and invention and corporate governance, I think, is as important as thinking about product innovation. So in one sense, I'm punning to say there's not enough work being done on figuring out different models of governance that might have a longer time horizon, and also think more broadly about who the beneficiaries of companies are. There's some examples. They're often in somewhat exotic places, but there are companies turning to be B corporations, for example, to say we have both financial and social goals. There are others that have tried to bring in different stakeholders, but we need fresh thought about innovation and corporate governance, I think. Dan?
So I'll just add that it's not just the corporate. Just look at what happened to Boeing, and then start to think why it happened. And it happened because we also changed what are the legal requirements from a CEO, a CFO to the shareholders. And the end result is Boeing, a company which actually makes a lot of its money on defense, catering more to short-termism on Wall Street, and making decision where to allocate R&D funds on changing body frames of airplanes, but ended up with a completely unnecessary disaster like the MAX. Partly because those decisions were taking 15 years before, saying we are not legally allowed to make those massive investment into long-term R&D, because the CEO would lose his job, and the real job that I have now, corporate governance, is to make shareholders happy now and always now. And that's a big, big issue that I think we have to tackle, but I think we're running out of time in this session.
In fact, that is all we have time for today. I'd like to thank you both for joining us. I'd especially like to thank all of you for joining us, and I'd especially like to thank Dan and Woody for sharing your insights with us. Please visit CIFAR.ca to find out more about this series, to view recordings of this and other talks, and the recording from this talk will be up next week. Thanks, everyone. So long.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you for the wonderful comments in the chat.